Elizabeth, morning to you. What a pleasure having you here on ENC with us. So let's talk for a moment. We'll talk about vaccines and all that in a moment, but it is National Conservation Month, so it does fit in nicely with talking about the environment and the climate. So what is climate diplomacy, and are we any good at it?
Sorry, for a long time, I think not only South Africa but other countries in the world have regarded climate in a particular niche. It's in the context of environment, biodiversity, and so on. But I think increasingly what we're seeing is that climate change is actually it's a cross-sectional issue. You have to actually have a coordinated, integrated government strategy, but I would also argue a South African incorporated strategy around how you help your economy to manage the transition away in the South African context from a high carbon intensive economy to one that is more green friendly, based on renewables and so on and so forth. And so that requires us not to just think about climate change and how we engage with it through the narrow prism perhaps of environment and the intersect with foreign affairs, but it's about trade and industry. We already see from a COVID perspective, our focus on the WTO and the TRIPS waiver. It's about science and technology. Climate change is going to be fundamentally about how we make sure we don't lose out in the race for technology that helps us to make that transition, and it's about making it fair. So climate diplomacy is really the way we should be thinking about it, is how it can help us to address our social economic challenges, while at the same time transitioning to a more planet-friendly economic system in a just way. So the concept of a just transition, and that should all be part of the way in which we take our climate diplomacy strategy forward.
It's not to be flippant at all about the climate and conservation, not by any means. It's the forefront of my thoughts a lot of the day. But at the moment, this G7, very different to previous G7 summits, we're dealing with the little issue of COVID-19. Do you think it's going to be that high on the agenda as far as the environmental diplomacy versus, and this is my question to you, the issue of vaccines, those who have, those who don't, and those who need it? Essentially, South Africa is asking G7 countries to please give us some vaccines, and we'll take it. I'm not arguing we won't. I'm sure we'll take it. But it's the issue of the intellectual property rights behind this, which our president has been very vocal on. Do we have enough clout as a country at the G7 for us to be taken seriously for a request like that?
Well, of course, it's about much more than whether we have the clout. We're talking about very important entrenched interests, business interests in many G7 countries. Just to come back to the point about the agenda, of course, what Prime Minister Johnson has highlighted for the G7 are two key priorities. One is the response to COVID, and that's going to be the discussion, I think, for a good part of today. The other one is climate change, that they will be discussing tomorrow, and I think in both instances our president will be participating. And then they're also going to be looking at open societies and economies. I think the challenge with the TRIPS waiver is that in the context of the G7, the US has indicated that it's open to considering it, and it's being discussed at the WTO, but the devil is in the detail. So the US hasn't actually agreed with the South African and Indian proposal. They believe that there needs to be something else on the table, and they've asked other countries to come up with a proposal. The European members of the G7, including Britain, have not been keen to support the waiver. But the point here, of course, is with the European countries is that the decision, this is a trade issue, and so the competency lies entirely with the European Commission, and the European Commission has said quite clearly that this is not the direction in which it will go. So these are the negotiations that are going to be taking place in the WTO. I think this is going to be a lengthy process. I don't think the solution will come quickly. But in the context of vaccines, they already, I think yesterday, announced that they will be providing about 1 billion vaccines to to poorer countries. I think those largely mean low-income countries, and for middle-income countries, there might be some provision for some sort of concessional finance, but probably it's unclear what the scale of that of that would be.
Now, you're hearing that the US is going to be sending over 300,000 J&J vaccines to South Africa. The irony of that, we have J&J vaccines in America, but we can't get them because of the FDA. Just before I say goodbye to you, Elizabeth, I would like your thoughts on the talk we've been hearing from our president before he went to the G7, and obviously going to bring it up now. He believes that there's going to be an economic recovery. How tough a sell is that going to be, considering the issues we're having in the country with Eskom, SOEs? It's one thing to say there's an economic recovery coming, but the data doesn't seem to support that.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a very important point. I think the announcements that were made over the last couple of days probably create a much more solid, or a more solid platform anyway, to make that comment. Also, the stats that have come out in terms of GDP growth and so on. We are still as a country, we are still, I think, in a very vulnerable economic situation, But one of the biggest challenges in terms of being able to attract more investment, particularly investment in the new technologies, in the new sectors, which I think we have to focus on, is the issue of greater regulatory certainty. We have some good progress, for example, in the announcement around the independent power, being able to produce renewables off grid and so on, but and the South African Airways decision, which has also been a bit of a drag on the fiscus. I think he will argue that in terms of the other state-owned enterprises, they have put in place more effective boards. That the situation is there is certainly progress in trying to turn the situation around, but it will take time. But also to highlight then that we are moving in the right direction, and we need international support, particularly in the form of investment, but also in areas such as health. Potentially also issues around concessional finance needs to be on the table, even though we are a middle-income country.
It's always a pleasure speaking to you, Elizabeth Sideropoulos, making sense of very complicated issues succinctly as she can. Imagine if you and I, Elizabeth, had all day to chat, and I'm sure we'll speak again. What a pleasure. The Institute Chief Executive, that is the Institute of South African International Affairs, joining us.